The Last Man on Earth is a horror film which was filmed in Rome based on the 1954 novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. The film was directed by Ubaldo Ragona and Sidney Salkow. The film stars Vincent Price and França Batoya. The movie begins in 1968. The opening scene shows a bunch of dead bodies and a sign on a community church which has "The End Has Come" written on it. We then see the main character, Dr. Robert Morgan, waking up, which then showcases the opening title screen. He then sees dead bodies but is unbothered by them, claiming that there are more for the pit. He tries to radio anyone internationally, but he just hears a whistling static. He crafts wooden stakes, then goes outside and loads the two bodies into the back of his car. He then begins to drive past multiple dead bodies as he gets gas for his car. Then we see a post-apocalyptic looking city where he puts a gas mask on and a huge pit where he disposes of and burns the bodies. He reaches an abandoned grocery store and takes a big box full of garlic. After that, he goes to a mirror store and takes many mirrors with him. We then find out that Robert Morgan lives in a world where everyone else has been infected by a plague that has turned them into undead vampiric creatures that cannot stand sunlight, are scared of mirrors, and are repelled by garlic. They would kill Morgan if they could, but they are weak and unintelligent. Every day Morgan carries out the same routine. He wakes up, marks another day on the calendar, gathers his weapons, and then goes hunting for vampires. He kills as many as he can and burns the bodies to prevent them from coming back. At night, he locks himself inside his house. We see him turn his record on at night to lure the creatures to his house as he falls asleep. The next day he goes to a church to mourn his dead wife Virginia, in which he falls asleep unaware that when he wakes up, it's nighttime and he has to dodge creatures to get to his car to get back home. He makes it back home luckily, with the help of a mirror. He then plays some home movies and laughs hysterically, then begins to cry shortly after. A flashback sequence begins to explain that in December 1965, Morgan's wife Virginia and daughter Kathy had succumbed to the plague before it was widely known by the public that the dead would return to life. Instead of taking his wife to the same public burn pit used to dispose of his daughter's corpse, Morgan buries her without the knowledge of the authorities. Later, his wife returns to his home and attacks him. Morgan then became aware of the need to kill the plague victims with a wooden stake. Morgan figures out that he is immune to the bacteria from a bite by an infected vampire bat when he was stationed in Panama, which may have introduced a diluted form of the plague into his body. We then come back to the present day. After getting a new car, a dog appears in the neighborhood. Morgan, who is desperate for companionship, goes after the dog but fails to catch it. He spends some of the day searching for the dog and comes across bodies with iron spears through them. He thinks there are more survivors. He then returns home and attempts to radio anyone, but the dog reappears injured at Morgan's doorstep. Morgan takes the dog into his home and treats its wounds, looking forward to having company for the first time in 3 years. He quickly discovers that it also has become infected with the plague. Morgan starts burying the dog, which is now impaled with a wooden stake. He sinks further into depression and loneliness. After burying the dog, Morgan sees a woman in the distance. The woman, whose name is Ruth, is terrified of Morgan at first sight and runs from him. Morgan convinces her to return to his home, but then he is suspicious of her true nature. Ruth becomes ill when Morgan waves garlic in her face, but says that she has a weak stomach. Morgan's suspicion that Ruth is infected is confirmed when he discovers her attempting to inject herself with a combination of blood and vaccine that holds the disease at bay. Ruth draws a gun on Morgan, but ultimately surrenders it to him. She tells him that she is part of a group of people who are infected but under treatment, and was sent to spy on Morgan. The vaccine allows the people to function normally with the drug in the bloodstream, but once it wears off, the infection takes over the body again. Ruth explains that her people are planning to rebuild society as they dispose and destroy of the remaining humans, and that many of the vampires Morgan killed were still alive. Ruth desperately urges Morgan to run away, but he refuses. While Ruth is asleep, Morgan transfuses his own blood into her. She is immediately cured, and Morgan sees hope that, together, they can cure the rest of her people. Moments later though, Ruth's people attack. Morgan takes the gun and runs from his home while the attackers kill the vampires gathered around Morgan's home. Ruth's people spot Morgan and chase him. He gets into a gunfight with them while running and picks up tear gas grenades from a police station armory along the way. While the tear gas delays his pursuers somewhat, Morgan is wounded by gunfire and retreats into a church. As he stands at the altar, one of his pursuers finally impales him with a thrown spear. In his final moments, Morgan denounces his pursuers as freaks, and as Ruth cradles him, declares that he is the last true man on Earth. As Ruth walks away from Morgan's body, she notices a baby crying and tries to assure the child that everyone is safe now. Then the movie ends. I appreciate the emptiness of the neighborhood and surround buildings with the dead bodies. It adds a nice touch to the atmosphere of the film's plot. I like the scene where the main character's wife comes back from the dead and attacks him. This film is a nice classic horror film.